Okay, good afternoon. What do we have? 4 more weeks left in the semester? Something like that? Wow. There's still so much more to learn, isn't there? It gives me great pleasure today to welcome Robert Benson to give us a lecture. Robert Benson is at the Miami of Ohio, and he's come up today to talk to us about developments at Cranbrook as well as in Cincinnati. What promises to be quite a stimulating lecture. And once you understand the importance of these communities, particularly as design matters in their development, you'll start to see some particular relationships that resonate with us. We're in the middle of the Midwest. We're in a place that has a proud tradition of places like Columbus where design matters as well. And so this helps to kind of situate the context of our Midwestern identity, let's say. Robert Benson holds the doctorate in the history of art from the University of Michigan. He has been the director of the graduate studies and currently is professor and chair of the Department of Architecture and Interior Design at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. His main research interests are the history of modernism and American architectural journalism. He teaches courses in modern and contemporary architecture, recent architectural theory and criticism, as well as general surveys of architectural history. From 1982 to 1992, he was a contributing editor to Inland Architect magazine, and he served as architecture critic for the Detroit News and the Cincinnati Enquirer. He's published articles and reviews in most of the major American architectural journals and in such international periodicals as Baumeister, Canadian Architect, A+U, and Architecture and Urbanism in Slovakia. He's an honorary member of the Detroit chapter of the American Institute of Architects. When he's not throwing bricks at buildings, Bob is a composer. His choral and organ music as well have been published by Mark Foster Music, Trinidad Press, and Augsburger Fortress Publishers. So he has a kind of a broad range of interests that he brings to architecture as well. And with that, we are very delighted to welcome Dr. Robert Benson to Ball State University.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Is this working? You're hearing me? Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I think I've actually pointed this down. Is that possible? Does this work better like this? There. Okay, good. It is a delight to be here. This is not my first visit to Ball State, but I haven't been here actually for a long time. I came in the building this afternoon, and it seemed as though there was just a buzz of activity, and I loved that. And I've always had a certain kind of personal relationship with Ball State for reasons that you would never believe. And one of those is that David Hermanson was my first history teacher when I was a student in the B.Arch program at the University of Kansas way back in the 60s. So it may be as much his fault as anybody else's that I ended up as an architectural historian rather than a designing architect. But it's great to be here today in any case. I want to talk to you informally today, and I hope that you will feel free to raise your hand and or shout out or say shut up or whatever you want to do in order to make this a little more interactive, because it's, this is what all educational theory and my experience tells me is the worst possible situation for learning. I'm lecturing, you're listening. But given the format and the sort of normal expectations of lectures, I'm willing to have interruptions and to go in whole new ways if that's what should happen. Kevin is right. The issues that we're going to talk about today are issues that we are all concerned about. And we're particularly concerned about them as educators and as students and as members of university communities, because it always seems as though somebody else is making the decisions about who builds what where. I don't know whether it's true here, but I will say that at Miami, The Department of Architecture and Interior Design is privileged to have a seat on the Campus Planning Commission every year. And that committee decides nothing important. So when I see some of the things that we're going to talk about here today, part of what I want you to understand is how it happened and why it happened the way that it did. Because what happened at Cranbrook and what's happening at the University of Cincinnati will never happen at Miami. I would guess it will never happen at Ball State, but you know, I won't impose that on you. Maybe you'll be able to make changes. I want to very briefly run through the background at Cranbrook, just in case you don't know. You probably know something about this from history courses, but just as a point of reference. Cranbrook is a private institution. It was founded by George and Ellen Scripps Booth, who were Detroiters, but George Booth was born in England, and he came to the United States. He married Ellen Scripps, and her father was the publisher of the Detroit News, and George Booth ultimately inherited the Detroit News and became its publisher himself. That has a very important consequence in the history that we're going to talk about here. But the other side of his life was that he was extremely interested in the arts and crafts movement and was a member of the Arts and Crafts Society in Detroit. And he wanted to have a school of art. He also, along with Ellen, wanted to have a boys' school in the suburbs of Detroit. George was English, and he wanted to see a boys' school that was going to train a choir that would sing at Christ Church Cranbrook, which was a church that he also patronized, designed by Bertram Goodhue. So it's clear that Goodhue was not his choice for the architecture of the school, and that leaves us then to consider what the Saarinens meant. Eliel Saarinen won second place in the Chicago Tribune competition. Before that time, no one in the United States had ever heard of him. Although his wife claims to have had a dream prior to that competition that announced to her, quite miraculously, that he would win it and they would come to the United States and move here. All of that came true, so we should have probably have gotten her to do lottery tickets or something. But in any case, the interesting thing about Eliel Saarinen's second place in the Chicago Tribune competition is that although Hood and Howells won the building competition and had their building built. It was a neo-Gothic tower, and that building was the nail in the coffin of Gothic revivalism as far as skyscraper architecture was concerned, because even Hood and Howells saw the second place competition and said, whoa, that's what we should have done. So Saarinen came to Chicago in 1923 with the money that he earned as the second place prize winner. He did some urban design interventions just as a personal effort. Nobody bought into them. He then, in 1924, was appointed to the faculty of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, went there, did similar sorts of urban intervention projects for the city of Detroit that were never acceptable to anybody, but met a young man at the University of Michigan named Henry Booth, whose father was George Booth. And Henry Booth invited Eliel Saarinen and his wife, Loya, who was also an artist, a fibers or textiles artist, to come to dinner at their home in Bloomfield Hills. And when the Saarinens met the Booths, it was a kind of epiphany for everybody. George Booth realized he had found the person who could not only design the schools that he was interested in, but could also direct the program that he hoped would be a graduate art academy, and that's exactly what happened. So by 1925, this master plan was introduced, and I'm going to see if I've got a mouse. Oh, good. I've got a cursor that can show us some things. This represents Lone Pine Road, which is an east-west street in Detroit, or in the suburb of Bloomfield Hills, between Telegraph Road on the west and on the east, Woodward Avenue. And there's a much larger piece of land than what's shown on this master plan, but Eliel Saarinen proposed that people enter the complex this way. This is Academy Way. Over here is the boys' school. These are all the buildings that he proposed for the academy, including housing for the faculty. Eventually, buildings that would house libraries and museums and all kinds of other things, maybe concert halls, I don't know what all. And you'll notice that he has this interesting idea about axes that are not necessarily parallel to one another and cross at oblique angles, and also that the axes are defined by edges that are expanding and contracting, a kind of an idea of animation or organicism, perhaps, something that he learned from Camillo Sitta in his urban planning studies in the late 19th century in Vienna. So this was the plan, and this is the model that he made for it, seen up above, pretty much in relationship to the plan we just looked at. This is looking north this way. Here we are looking south that way. And then here is the boys' school. Now, this land was actually the Booth family farm, and Albert Kahn, the great industrial architect in Detroit, had designed a house for the Booths, and they lived there. But the idea that George Booth had was that he had all these outbuildings, and he really thought that probably what could happen is that they could be adaptively reused to become the boys' school. Well, Eliel Saarinen investigated them, analyzed them carefully, and said, you know, they're really not structurally sound enough to do this. I think that's not going to be a good idea. But the compromise solution was that he would design the boys' school in such a way that the general massing and configuration of the farm buildings would become the general massing and configuration of the boys' school. What you have here is a silo turned into an observatory, and barns turned into classroom buildings and residence halls. Now, there doesn't seem to be too much discussion or difference of opinion over the fact that the Booth family in England really saw this new school as something that should have a kind of an English flavor to it. So people have, of course, for years talked about the fact that it looks like medieval architecture, except that if you really study it carefully, you discover that there isn't a single quotation from anything medieval anywhere. There are materials that remind us of medieval architecture: leaded glass, brick carefully worked, limestone carved carefully. But in the long run, the flavor of medievalism is there with a very, very careful attention to every single surface as an effort or as an object of design. So this is kind of what you're seeing there. And yes, there is this sense of an English village that we see in the faculty housing. This is the entrance to the Carl Milles house here. Carl Milles was a sculptor that Eliel Saarinen brought from Sweden to be on the faculty of the academy. These were part of the academy buildings. This is now the administration for the whole community there. But this is pretty much what the flavor of those early buildings was all about. Now, this is what the Booth farm looked like when Eliel Saarinen met up with it. And the other thing that we have to understand is that not only did he take care of designing the buildings and doing the master plan and sort of thinking about the future of the architecture, he thought about the future of the landscape, and he planted and planted and planted. And this is the kind of image that we have at Cranbrook today. All those fields now looking as though they were primeval forest. And yes, it is an artifice at one level, except there's nothing here, no palm trees growing here, as you might expect in certain kinds of buildings that have atriums. Everything here is natural to the site, but this was part of the whole atmosphere that he tried to create. Ellen Scripps Booth decided that there should be a girls' school. She personally donated $200,000 to begin that process around 1928 or 29. This is the school that was built according to Saarinen's designs from 30 to 31. And here again, I call your attention to every surface as an object of design. Columns, this idea of the telescoping column was a very interesting concept for Saarinen. It was the concept really underlying his design for the Tribune competition entry, and it seems to be something that he did very frequently. But here again, each surface of the column treated as though it was something that should be carefully considered, and ornament was introduced where it was feasible and where it made sense. You'll notice also behind this column here and the spandrels, all of this brick pattern was carefully worked out just as much as the surface relief on the columns here. This is one of two major entrances into Kingswood School. He used local pottery, or I'm sorry, tile that was done by the pottery factory of Pewabic in Detroit. He used metal workers, and of course, wouldn't we give something to have this kind of a stairway today? What code would permit that stair railing to be there? But we have to come up with other ideas. Here's leaded glass in this, at this landing, and then a rug woven by Loya Saarinen, Eliel's wife, still in use today in the school. By the late 1930s, the Booth family wanted to expand the academy and to keep building on the master plan, and they asked Eliel Saarinen to create a museum and a library for the complex, which was built between 1938 and 1942. You will see that suddenly there is no more English vocabulary here, but many of the same design ideas still exist, and here's how the plantings in that central so-called Triton pool area now have grown up. Now we have a light-colored brick and Mankato stone, a soft yellow limestone from the Mankato area of Minnesota. We have surfaces very carefully treated, whether they are the floor of this portico, the wall above the door, the surround of the door, the relief of the letters over the doorway, or the ceiling. Every single surface an object of design intention. Here again, these wonderful reliefs that somehow look as though they were applied, but of course we have to remember that the stone was at least that thick when all of this carving was done and begun, so that the actual framing of the doorway would look as though it were there first. A fountain just beyond that portico by Carl Millis. This is the Orpheus fountain. And then in the 1930s, George Booth also wanted to realize his idea for having a science institute and a planetarium. He designed the original buildings in 1930. In 1936, Eliel Saarinen altered them and added onto them. Another Detroit architect, William Kapp, who worked for a while for Smith, Hinchman and Grills, did other additions in 1955 and in 1960. And then this light pylon was designed collaboratively by Eliel Saarinen and George Booth in 1938. I think that it's very interesting. You might say, well, George Booth is paying the bill, so he gets to call the shots here. I bet that's why they did this. But the fact is that Eliel Saarinen collaborated many, many times throughout the history of Cranbrook with other architects and sometimes with amateur designers. He also did such things as allow the masons to place certain kinds of found objects. I'm really talking about maybe carved stone or unusual baked brick in the walls where they wanted to. He would say, these have to go in the walls, you decide where to place them. So that he relinquished the absolutist control that you would assume that somebody who is so devoted to universal design would want to maintain. And I think that's an important tradition at Cranbrook. Well, by the 1980s, there was a lot of maintenance that had been deferred from the buildings of the 1920s and 30s. This is a parking lot in between the Art Academy and the Boys' School, and I show you this for two reasons. First of all, to show you that, in fact, that shape, that trapezoidal shape that we see dominating the plan concept, is actually in the paving, but also to show you that the paving was beginning to deteriorate. There was all kinds of deterioration. Whole walkways had to be torn out. Brickwork had to be dismantled and rebuilt. Whole stairways had to be reconstructed with concrete substructures and then covered with brick and stone. And this was a very expensive undertaking. There was another issue, and that was that the Art Academy had outgrown much of its space, and it needed more space. And one of the things that it needed was an auditorium. And the Academy was unsure what to do. The idea was that they had this legacy from Saarinen. They didn't want to have anything spoil it. So they said, how can we design an audience space for a lecture hall that isn't just going to be some kind of a carbuncle on this lovely, lovely campus? So they decided, well, the easy thing to do is to bury it. So they did, and they buried it underneath the Orpheus Fountain. The Orpheus Fountain was removed. They got the moving equipment in, dug it out, and produced this audience hall, which was actually designed by Saarinen's grandson, Robert Saarinen Swanson, along with some graduates of the Academy. And I don't think they should have. But if you look at it, you can see that it has nothing to do with the Saarinen tradition. It has fairly rough, natural concrete columns. It's kind of the sort of thing you would expect to see in a corporate office center, maybe in a little, small convention hall or something. Basically, it houses the people, but it really doesn't create the kind of architecture that it's in the neighborhood with. So I guess I'm glad they buried it. They also, in this year, hired HOK to study the master plan of the campus and to make some suggestions about where other kinds of buildings could go. This is where that DeSalle Auditorium went, but they said, what about a new studio building? Because we are desperately in need of studio space. So they said, well, maybe over here it could go. Kind of out of the way and back, there's a triangular piece of land, so we'll just kind of make a triangular building there. This is not a design, I might add. This is not anything except just a suggestion for where the building could go. They also wanted to have a suggestion for where they might propose a fine arts center. And they said, well, at the opposite end of the long axis that crosses the axis that comes up from Academy Way, right here, we can just sort of crowd some buildings around there and kind of bury them as low as possible and maybe have some roofs show. Well, they also made some suggestions about the Institute of Science and a new entrance from Woodward Avenue that would eliminate the heavy traffic on Academy Way that had grown because of the large numbers of people that came to visit the school and the academy and the Science Institute on a weekly basis or even a daily basis. Well, at the time that this was going on, I was on the staff at Inland Architect, and I got the assignment to look at the Cranbrook Academy's work and to talk about what was happening there. And I analyzed what was going on, and I said, I really don't think, and you can read the article to see what I really exactly said, but in effect what I said was, I really don't think this is a very responsible way to extend the Saarinen legacy. In the first place, if you have to bury buildings and hide them in the woods, you're really not getting the best building that you could get, because you wouldn't want to do that with a really good building. In the second place, I don't think that graduates of this academy necessarily have been initiated into all of its mysteries and therefore have the exclusive right to design additional buildings for the campus. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, but not because of their graduation from the academy. Wouldn't it be better to understand that Saarinen himself was a collaborator, that he was always interacting with other architects, that he never had absolute control over anything that he put out, and that this wonderful legacy was really a joint production? Wouldn't it be better to have international competitions for really good buildings that are really carefully sited and that would extend the master plan and make sense out of it, rather than pretending that we can put it on ice and hold it there forever, kind of like we used to go and visit Stalin on Red Square, embalmed in his coffin. So Dan Hoffman, who was at that time just newly come to Cranbrook from Edward Larrabee Barnes' office, also felt the same way, and I interviewed him in my article as a sidebar. Well, lo and behold, much to my utter amazement, Lillian Botter, who was the president of the Cranbrook Educational Community, which is the way the whole institution defines itself now, passed this article out to the Board of Trustees, and they decided to do it. They didn't necessarily take all of my suggestions for what should go where. That was probably smart. But they did decide to have a competition for everything that was new. And so I think I'm going to do this right. Is this how I want to get to the next PowerPoint? Okay, good. I don't know which one is which. Okay. And the very first piece that was Am I doing this right? Am I just impatient? There we go. Okay. The first competition was somewhat failed. There were several entries. There was one that the competition jury liked from Machado and Silvetti. Somehow it didn't get built, and so Dan Hoffman took things in hand, and he had reopened the Cranbrook Architecture Office that had been the actual office that Saarinen had run while he was the director of the academy, and out of which he designed the first Christian church in Columbus, Indiana, and so forth. This is the gateway that he proposed and built with these two other architects, including Juhani Palasmaa, who is a Finnish architect. Oops, going the wrong way. And if you would see this at night, you would see that the mesh it catches light that comes up from underneath. And I've never heard this said, but it may be written someplace. I think that probably the inspiration for this was birds' wings. And I say that not because of the TWA terminal at Idlewild, now Kennedy, but because the name Cranbrook was brought from England to this place, and it really means crane in the brook, or a brook with cranes. And so I think that the idea of having the wings here that would suggest the crane or crane of Cranbrook, along with this huge sweeping curve here, which may, in one way or another, relate to the sweeping curve of water embedded in the ground as the way it is here, may be the inspiration for the design. There was a school that had been founded here for children K through 6, as well as the boys' school, which was more a middle school and now a high school. This was in sore need of much more room, and so Peter Rose was asked to design an addition to the school. This is what he came up with, and you can perhaps assume that there's a certain kind of childlike romanticism in windows like we see here, but the materials all come from nearby buildings, perhaps not the steel, that may be a little bit broader context, but if you would stand at this doorway facing the door and then turn around 180 degrees, you would see this, Thornley, the house that Henry Booth designed for himself and his wife, and there you see the way that the windows use brick and the way the block is used, and in this case, this is not tile, but the traditional materials of the roof are found there. This takes us down to the lower level. The school is built in the floodplain of one of the tributaries of the Rouge River, and so that's why it was called Brookside School, because it really was beside a brook. And it's also built as a series of smaller pavilions linked together with other elements that, once again, are much more perhaps reminiscent of modernism than they are of anything historical, and yet have a scale and a quality that relates them to what we see here in the traditional areas and traditional materials. Wooden elements here in redwood, beautifully introduced. And then this is the way the building actually relates to the original Brookside School. This is just one of the buildings there. When we go inside, I'd like you to notice the careful detailing of the brick here on the inside of the wall at the reveal, as well as the way in which wood is suspended here instead of drop-in ceiling. The kinds of concern for children, 2 stair rails, one smaller and lower for children, one larger and larger diameter and higher for adults. This is one of the science rooms, and here is the set of cabinets which are at child height, but the teacher can reach up for the higher elements up above. All simple things, but very carefully thought out. This is a kindergarten room with an exposed wood beam ceiling and places for children to play and create their own games. This is a music room with space for both choral and instrumental music. The doors are given detailing that allows a child to stand up against it and measure how tall he or she is and whether he or she has grown. The diffusers for the heating system are detailed carefully, as are the doors for the lockers. And you'll notice the doors are missing numbers. Each child learns what the design on the door that he or she is assigned to is, and that's how they find the location for their coat and anything else that they have brought. They're small children, they don't bring much, but the idea, which fascinates me, is that they're asked to look in a way that you wouldn't look if you were simply looking for a number. The Institute of Science was added onto by Stephen Hall, and the Herb Family Science Garden was designed by Peter Osler, a landscape architect in Ann Arbor. For a number of reasons, I think this is probably the least successful of all of the new buildings. Not because I think Stephen Hall is a bad designer, by no manner of means do I believe that. But I think that there were some unfortunate things that happened. There was a change of directorship at the academy in the middle of the design process, or even once that maybe it was even into the ground. There were other issues that had to do with programming and with school visits that hadn't been resolved when this design went into the ground. So when we look at some of the elements on the interior, we can understand some of those problems. But I also think it probably is one of these buildings of all of them that we're going to see that least engages its site. I find this to be a not terribly compelling elevation. It's okay. I can understand maybe why you would do it. There are some interesting things here in terms of coursing and the glass here. But in the long run, for instance, the cantilevered corner here somehow seems as though it's revealing something that we really don't want to see underneath it at the loading dock. But in the garden area, in the middle, it's much more successful, and maybe that's where we should really pay attention. Maybe we weren't really supposed to walk around the building. The issue on the interior is that there are so many school children that come here that this lobby can't accommodate them anymore. So they're actually building a new reception center that will allow buses to unload children, let them leave their lunches, their coats, and then get back on the bus and come over here and enter the Science Institute without anything encumbering them. Because as you can see here, this is the only amount of seating that there would be for, 200 children that might be coming from a school? They probably wouldn't come all at once, but even if there's 50 or if there are 25, it's very crowded. So that is kind of a problem that probably no one really could have foreseen. There is some nice detailing in this area as well by Stephen Hall. And the door handles here actually are the plan of his addition without the plan of the original institute. The effect of the glass that we see on the exterior is really quite amazing on the inside. But this picture, I think, begins to show one of the problems that may not be Stephen Hall's problem, but may be the curator's problem, and that is that the impact that you have with walls that are red, floors that are green, and the exhibits that are very colorful is that the building seems to fight with its contents. And I was disappointed by this because I like Stephen Hall's work so much and in so many ways, and there are many, many things that recommend this, but somehow or other, to me, as an ensemble, it was not nearly as strong as other buildings that have been built in this proposition. But maybe some of these things will change because the renovations of the old part of the Science Institute were really quite wonderful. And I don't have any pictures of them, so I'm sorry to tell you how great they are without being able to prove it. The building that I think is probably one of the best in the complex is the Williams Natatorium by Todd Williams and Billy Chen. And you may think, well, isn't that interesting? He got to do a natatorium named for somebody with his name. No, his family paid for it. They're the Sherwin-Williamses of Detroit, the Williams of Sherwin-Williams, and he was a graduate of Cranbrook. There was probably a competition here, and it was sort of like when Brunelleschi had a competition for the Dome of Florence, and everybody knew in advance who won. I think it's a good choice. I'm not arguing about that, but there are probably some politics there that explain some things. This is the first view that you would have of the natatorium if you visited Cranbrook, and what we're looking at is this area right here. This is a wing of the natatorium, and when you first see it, it's not clear what it is. If you would walk down to that end of the, or down to that wall and look back this direction, you would see that we're at the west end of of that long cross axis. We're way down here, and now we're looking up this direction. And if we would go past the Academy Way, which is the street here, and go past the library and the museum, past the portico, and through this portico here, and look further, we would see that that axis at the east end concludes at the Cranbrook house that was designed by Albert Kahn for the Booth family. So the Williams Chen building definitely terminates that axis, but without any kind of bravura. No major vertical element saying, you know, here we are and pay attention. But for all that much more reason then, we are concerned about what this is, and we go and look at it and find out that it has all kinds of subtleties to it. And what we actually are looking at here is the wall of the part of the building that holds the handicap access ramp, the universal accessibility ramp. And it's very carefully detailed. The paving in front of it is carefully detailed. The brickwork is carefully detailed. No effort to come to a perfect intersection of the two planes, but to let them dovetail together. And the same on the edges of the building. Very, very subtle. The color is subtle. The turquoise glazed brick is a wonderful subtle color that suits the landscape there. Also suits the weather in Michigan. I happened to take these pictures on a day where obviously it was cloudy. Go to school here, many days of the year it's going to be cloudy in Michigan. And so I think that it was probably as good a test as any to see how the building worked. This is the opposite side of the universal accessibility ramp wing. This is a bridge that bridges back to one of the original gymnasium buildings. You can see that on the underneath side, this concept of treating every surface as a design object of or an object of design intention works there. The idea of two bars that somehow are parallel to each other, may be closer together or farther apart, also appears in the signage at the doorways and other places in the building. It also seems to be the source of horizontal windows and other elements. So as we walk around the building, these are the kinds of views that we get of it. And you see here, again, this very subtle introduction of the turquoise glazed tile in the midst of this darker red tile. This is an emergency exit leading out to this platform. And here again, the reveal shows that tile. If we go inside, we find that that idea of the two bars is now a three-dimensional experience here in this seating, or in this light box that is simply covering of a plain plate glass window on the outside, or this one which borrows light from a skylight and introduces it into a floor below, lighting this area as though it were simply inhabiting the space. There is the ramp itself, another detail of it, showing the concern here for a kind of a rhythmical pattern of very simple battens. And then if you would go into the actual pool room, this is one of the most amazing experiences of the building. As you can see, the ceiling is dark blue, as though it were a night sky, and the the ceiling seems to be lit almost by a sporadic sprinkling of lights. The building can be opened to the exterior in good weather by these panels that swivel and simply open against the reveal. This is what they look like on the outside. So you walk by and you think, oh, those windows are boarded up, until you look carefully and say, no, well, that's a lot nicer wood than I would board my window up with. And then you discover that, in fact, the building can be actually opened to the outdoors. But it can be also opened up above at the ceiling level, because what you see here are large, essentially truncated cones, and they are circular at the top, and the panel opens so that when you're looking up, then you look out into the sky, day or night, in good weather. And in terms of any of you who swim, if you've done the backstroke, you know that you need to have some kind of light to be able to make a judgment about whether you're in your lane or not. And actually that happens here. They arrange these so that they look totally scattered and arbitrary, and in fact they are not. So this building is really one that I think is quite spectacular. Finally, the most recent building is Rafael Maneo's new studios building. And you can see that rather than being over here in a triangular patch hidden away, it is actually added onto this wing of the museum. The museum is basically a T shape here, and the studios building adds on here. This is the area you'll never be, you won't be surprised when I tell you this is the most industrial part of the studios building. This is where the foundry is. This is where the most technical equipment is for ceramics, for kiln firing, and where the most difficult vat and dye processes are for fibers. So those are the three kinds of studios that are in this building, and they occupy the 3 floors that you see opening out here. And there's the outdoor foundry. There's the back of the building facing south. There it is again. This is the metal studio. This is the ceramic studio, and this is the fiber studio. You come in from the main quadrangle. There are 2 galleries, one at the entry level, one above that. Entry level is a student gallery, totally managed by students, a new exhibit every week. The one upstairs is probably controlled in part by the academy and in part by the museum. This is the kind of space that it is, not a surprising kind of space. But here are the foundry for this is part of the metal studios. Every student has a cubicle with views out to the woods nearby. This is the corner studio. The corner of the building is reserved for the artist and resident studios. This is the metal studio. This is the ceramic studio, and everything here is movable, and movable to the extent that, number one, they can wash the entire floor down, even though it's on the 2nd level of the building, and clean it out. Movable also so that anything that is fabricated can be wheeled on, well, this kind of rack or on this kind of rack here to these Blau kilns, which are the latest word in firing, according to what I learned when I was there. They're all computerized, and if you have a problem, you simply get on the phone with Mr. Blau in Holland, and he solves the problem on the internet, and you're off to and running. So they're very, very high-end studios, and they are, of course, again, in this building that has the lead-coated copper on the exterior. These are the fiber studios, including the studio of the artist in residence there. And they have the windows that are the highest, and they see a lot of sky as well as some trees. This is a set of windows that are just at the junction between the museum and the studios building, where you see the building, and that is this room right here. It's obviously part of the new part of the building. And what is going to happen is that the next step is to enclose this area as a courtyard, so that the museum will extend eastward this way and enclose this. There will probably be an entrance from the parking lot. I'm not sure what else is planned in the master plan, but that is what is happening right now. This is probably the gutsiest of the additions. The Williams and Chen addition is probably the most refined. Maybe people would argue Peter Rose's is more refined or equally refined, maybe so. I think Williams and Chen's is subtler. This one is not subtle, it's very well handled, but much gutsier, and has sort of the sense of the real power of metalwork and the kinds of studio instruction that the Saarinen like to enjoy. Now, I have a short PowerPoint that follows this. I realize I'm probably past the time that I should be. Looking at the clock, we're close to 5. But I want to show you, oops, there's that paperclip again. I want to show you what's going on in Cincinnati, because there is a unique opportunity to compare what's happening at Cranbrook with what is happening and has happened at the University of Cincinnati in this enormous building program that they've gone on to. I think it's probably $250 million in total scope. And we at Miami still don't know how they do it. We haven't figured that part out yet. But this plan was put into place by a number of people. A lot of credit goes to Jay Chatterjee, who was the dean of the College of Design, Architecture, Art, and Planning. And he does have some responsibility for it. Some of it has to do with the University Architect's Office. I don't know how the politics of Ball State work, but at Miami University, the university architect is just a functionary in the Buildings and Grounds Department, in what we call physical facilities. At UC, the university architect is a vice president. And I think that makes a huge difference in terms of the kind of argument that he can engage in with other administrators. So if you can get the university architect's ear bent, and you have good people that you consult with who will be able to convince a president like Joseph Steger, who was the president when all of this was put in place, they convinced him that they could market the university 2,000% better with good architecture than they could without good architecture. Now, why don't we do this at Cranbrook? Because we don't have a campus that big at Cranbrook, and we have a tradition that we don't want to lose, we want to build on. Why don't we do it at Miami? Because we don't know what it is if it isn't Neo-Georgian. We have a new business school that's being built. They just announced who the architect is. Can you guess who it would be? Absolutely, Robert A.M. Stern. What a surprise. Well, here, the issue was they didn't believe that they had a tradition. They believed that the campus was not worth much. Now, I'm not sure I would agree with that 100%, but they made a really radical choice to just simply rethink the entire campus. And we're not talking even about the medical campus where the Gary Vance Molecular Center is. This is the Eisenman building here, the DAAP. There is the Engineering Research Building by Michael Graves. Up here is the addition to CCM by Harry Cobb. And you've all seen Eisenman's building. I guess I forgot to put in the animation, so you don't get to see the model, but this, it looks pretty much like that. There is the Graves building in several different views. And when these buildings were built, I really had the impression that they were just going to turn this into an architectural theme park. I mean, people say that about Miami. I've said it about Miami. We have an architectural theme park. It's just that it's, bad Neo-Georgian architecture. Here, it seemed as though the idea was to have an example of everything. We're going to have our Eisenman building. We're going to have our Graves building. We're going to have our Frank Gehry building. We're going to have our everybody building. And they've gone to every major architect that you can think of to get buildings. And I really didn't think it was going to work. And yet, I think that there are some really strong things happening here. What you're looking at here is the new recreational sports facility by Morphosis. That's this roof, this element, and this element that wraps around the stadium. And that's what you see if you come up from the library parking lot. This is looking south. There it is going into the ground right now. And what this building represents, along with other buildings that we're going to be looking at, and this was the rendering of the building, so this is how Morphosis wanted them to understand it. All of the buildings that you see here are what are called Main Street buildings. This becomes the main walkway through the campus for the students. This is what's called the Student Life Building. It has like offices for student government and student organizations, all kinds of student services of that sort. This is the student union that is the Tangeman Center. It has food courts and meeting rooms and auditoriums, places to have dances, all that sort of thing. And then up here is what is now the enrollment services, where you go to the bursar, where you go to the registrar, where you go for financial aid, all the different kinds of things that have to do with what students need to do. And that's not what was originally planned here. The original idea was that we were going to have a new building for DAAP, classroom building. We're going to have a new engineering research facility and advanced research facility. And the UC marketing team, that is the people that they hired to do marketing for them, said, you know, that's all fine and dandy, but that's not going to get anybody here as a student to enroll. You've got to get student-centered buildings. So they suddenly are building every possible, I mean, not just for athletics at the varsity level. I'm talking about, this is a student recreational building where any student can go and swim or play racquetball or play tennis or do anything else that you can do in a recreational sports facility. And I will say Miami built theirs first, so you know, maybe they copied us, but I don't know. They certainly didn't copy us architecturally. This is the way that Main Street works. On the left here is part of this student recreation building. This is the student life building. This is what it looks like. Here it is being built, and then this is the student life building already built. This is the east side, I'm sorry, of the Tangeman Center. This is the Guatemi Siegel building. The student life building is Moore Rubel Udell, and that's what this is in this panorama. This is the Morphosis building. But this is the north side of the student life building, and I think that's just pretty spectacular. It's a pretty engaging set of relationships. And this is the south side of it, the opposite side. So it's a long, skinny building that turns, you know, a curve. There we are getting up to the top of it. And then this is the Student Enrollment Services building. And these buildings all then face the McMicken Commons, which now looks bigger than it ever did and probably is bigger than it ever was. This is well, I guess I should explain that the Tangeman Center was the student center before all of this project took place, but it has been expanded by being surrounded by new construction that Guatemi Siegel designed and then incorporating parts of the old building into it. This is the McMicken Hall, the main classroom building that is on the west side of the UC campus on Clifton Avenue. This is the back side. It looks down at this area here, as you see there. And there you see some more of the Tangeman Center building, some of the larger elements that have been added. And then on the other side of Clifton Avenue, this is what the university is building for new student housing. Oh, so we are interested in marketing here, aren't we? This would go over big at Miami, but no, it has to be Neo-Georgian. There is the Tangeman Center here on the right and the student life building on the left. I will say, however, that I think that there are still some interesting problems. All of that openness has been gained at the disadvantage of some pretty heavy density, like, for instance, this passageway between the Graves Engineering Research Building and some of the other engineering buildings. This is not a particularly pleasant space, and I think it would be particularly, no matter how well lit it is, particularly unpleasant at night. The effort has been to try to landscape the campus in ways that, to me, in some way, and to some extent, seem less practical than visually. And I think visually it's stimulating. I'm not sure that it's as practical. I tend never to find anybody there when I go to the campus using this space except walking through it. But I think that the real issue is the risk that they have taken, and I think it was a good risk. I wasn't sure it was 10 years ago, 5 years ago, but I think that what's happened in the meantime is I wish that more of us could find ways to communicate with the administration and trustees of institutions like this so that we had an opportunity to really raise the general design level of the campus, even if we don't rebuild it. Why should we? I mean, this is a lovely campus in many ways, but you could do some really great interventions here just the way we could at Miami if we could just convince people that you don't have to do it the way you always did it. Well, I think I'm definitely out of time, so thank you very much. You've been very patient. We have time for a few questions if some of you